Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book entitled Fall of the House of Dixie by Professor Bruce Levine. The book tells the story of how the Civil War upended the economic, political, and social life of the Old South. Its author, Professor Levine, is a history professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana, Champaign, and is with me today to discuss his book. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Bruce, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. All the way from Pasadena, from the Huntington Library, where you're spending a year doing research. So it's not just from Urbana, Champaign,
Right.
which is far enough, but it's 2.5 times as far. Anyway, why don't we begin by asking you to describe the really amazing wealth and political power of the South before the Civil War, and the particular individuals who were most prominent in having that wealth and exercising that personal power. They were, of course, slave masters. You might even mention how many slaves were owned by some of them, because it's staggering when you read it.
Right. Well, as you say, they are slave masters. This per capita is, if by per capita you mean per white person, this part of the country contains the richest counties in the country and the richest families in the country. They have benefited tremendously from slavery, and they are able to translate that wealth into tremendous political clout as well, so that they run the state legislatures within their own states. All the studies show that overwhelmingly. And not just slave owners, but the biggest slave owners. The census retains the title of planter for a slave owner who owns more than 20 people. And planters are very disproportionately represented in state governments. But they also have tremendous political clout, as I started to say, at the national level. Look at the era between Washington's inauguration and Lincoln's inauguration. The majority of presidents are Southerners. The overwhelming majority of cabinet ministers are Southerners. Right. Speakers of the House of Representatives, Supreme Court justices, and so on, disproportionately Southerners. And they're in a position to call the tune for much of American political life.
And I wrote down today the 15 presidents before Lincoln. I put the Southerners, or in a few cases, Southern sympathizers. There was a name for those guys.
Doughface.
Doughface, thank you. And on one side, it's kind of like a Nixonian up at this.
Right. And
it was something like 10 from the South, or Southern sympathizers, and 4 or 5 from the North.
That's right.
Prior to Lincoln.
That's right.
Which, and as you say, and it's not widely known, they did control the Supreme Court. They controlled the Congress. And I've always been led to believe, and maybe you could comment on this, that it was in part fury at the fact that they were being replaced as the people of maximum power in this country. That was one of the driving forces leading to secession.
No question about it. Jefferson Davis, in the decade prior to the Civil War, says at one point, the day that a man opposed to slavery is elected President of the United States will be the day in which we have effectively, these are not his words, but what his words add up to, a political revolution. We will have political power taken out of our hands, and from that point on, we will not be safe.
And the question or the issue of secession, or the possibility of secession, that was floating in the air for what, 30 years or so?
Yes, even in the 1830s,
right.
At the time when South Carolina tries to nullify
right.
federal law, and it gets very little support for that elsewhere in the South. Those who won't support the idea of nullifying federal law frequently make a point of saying, now if you want to secede, that's something else, and we would support you in that.
Really?
Yes.
Really? Didn't Jackson threaten to hang John C. Calhoun or somebody?
Yeah.
So Jackson, who was from Tennessee and a Southerner,
and a slave owner,
so he had what one might laughingly call an irrepressible conflict with Calhoun, but I don't think he threatened to, well, I mean, that's about as far as it went. There was no real threat of war or true secession, I guess.
It was not likely, although it wasn't obvious at the time, I think. There were some who thought that it might come to blows between Jackson and South Carolina.
Ah, is that so? Well, that's amazing. I have heard it said, and I'm curious as to your opinion, that one of the benefits of the Missouri Compromise, and then after that the Compromise of 1850 in particular, was that it enabled the North to have 10 more years of growth, which entailed tremendous growth in both agriculture and industry and commerce, as opposed to industry, which made it hands down that the North was going to win the Civil War, whereas in 1840 or 1850, maybe not so. Do you have an opinion on that?
That's a tough call. The 1850s is a decade filled with economic recessions, too. I mean, so there's one in around 1853. There's a nasty one in 1857. So I'm not so sure that the North benefited tremendously economically from the postponement. It certainly benefited politically because the northern population was much more ready for war by 1860 and much more organized politically around slavery than it was in 1850. It's also hard to imagine who might have been as good a president as Lincoln turned out to be in war, had the war occurred in 1850.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about your book and about a biography I just read of William Seward, who was the Secretary of State under Lincoln and then a few more years under Andrew Johnson. Let me go back to the slave owners. Isn't it the case that some of these people owned 500 or 1,000 or even 1,500 slaves?
That's right. It's not the norm, but it certainly existed. There were people who owned, just as you say, 500, 1,000, 1,500 slaves.
Unimaginable. I mean, to the modern mind, it's unimaginable to own one.
Exactly.
1,500?
Right. Well, the whole world is very difficult to imagine, the world in which they lived. That's my experience with my students over the past 20, 30 years of teaching. They can't imagine, they can't put themselves in the place of either the slave or the slave owner because it's so far beyond their experience and so outside the pale of their sense of justice.
I would have to say that I can't put myself in that position either way. I mean, seriously, can you?
Well, I don't think we can, but it's the job of a historian to at least try.
Yeah. You might describe, because it'll explain a little bit about that world to people. You might describe the life that the planters, and I gather from what you've told me earlier that anybody with over 20 slaves was considered a planter for census purposes.
Right.
The life that the planters lived, particularly the ones that had scores and scores or even hundreds of slaves, and at the other end of the scale, the lives that the slaves lived.
Well, the lives that the planters, and especially the large planters, lived was, by the standards of the time, an extremely pleasant one. They lived, especially in the eastern portion, the most long-settled sections of the slave South. They lived in fine mansions, extremely expensive mansions filled with the most expensive furniture and decorations, frequently covering very large estates with magnificent lawns and equally magnificent staircases up to the doors and so on and so forth, multiple fireplaces and bedrooms and kitchens and what have you. And all of it is, of course, made possible by the wealth generated by the people whom they own and who labor for them. And their days are filled, as some of the plantation mistresses' diaries remind us, with all sorts of festivities and social engagements and so forth.
Right.
So they live very well indeed by the standards of the day.
Right. That's like sort of driving down Fifth Avenue
That's right.
and looking at all these houses from the 1870s and 80s that, like the Frick Mansion or whatever, wherever that was, you know, and say, my God, this is, you know, unbelievable. People
Right.
really live this way.
Right.
And there's still some of these antebellum houses left in the South, so I guess I've seen one or two of them. The slaves, on the other hand,
especially the great majority who were field hands, who worked in the cotton and the sugar and the tobacco fields, lived very, 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 I don't know how many very you can put into the sentence, difficult lives. They basically had subsistence.
yeah,
They had very basic housing. Their lives are pretty much governed by the interplay between the planter's desire to spend as little as they possibly can, just enough to keep these people alive, but also enough to keep these people alive because those people are valuable to them. So it's the interplay of let's try to keep the cost down, but let's not have them die on us unnecessarily. So the planters feed them as little as they can in order to keep them alive and energetic enough to do the labor.
For 25 years, the Massachusetts School of Law has been training great lawyers and building great relationships.
Joining MSL was more than just making friends. It was becoming a part of the family, which makes it very difficult to leave.
I don't want to leave MSL.
We didn't want to leave MSL ever! Best decision ever! We love MSL and we don't want to leave!
The Massachusetts School of Law. Great lawyers, better people. Come join our family. Visit us today at mslaw.edu.
since my son and his family live in Vienna, Virginia, recently, when I was down there, we went to George Washington's home, Mount Vernon. And Mount Vernon, of course, is in many ways very, very impressive. But I have to say that I reacted very, very badly when I saw the slave quarters. It just, let's see, I heard somebody say it on television the other day, but I can't, I'll use a different, ticked me off when you see things like that, you know. The guy lives in a lap of luxury, and these people are living in these hovels.
And that's why they can live in the lap of luxury, right?
That's right.
Because these people live in hovels. And because these people are working from first light until dark, and 6 days and 6+ days a week.
You know, it was thought, my understanding is that it was thought around the time of the Revolution, and even Lincoln and Seward thought, that slavery would die out of its own accord. The most I even looked up that very portion of your book today as to why they thought that. And the most I could get out of it is that they thought that the planters in the South would see the light and do the right thing, by the phraseology that we use today. No way, no way. This was so economically lucrative that these people were not going to change for anything.
Right. I completely agree with that. And especially, people frequently will say in conversation, well, surely slavery was on the way out anyway by the time of the Civil War, and so the Civil War was unnecessary.
Right.
The 1850s was probably the decade of some of the greatest profits made out of slavery in American history, and there was no reason to think, economically speaking, that this was a system on the way out by itself.
I guess among the reasons people thought it was on the way out was that it had been eliminated in Britain. The British Navy, with the concurrence of the American government, had for 30, 40 years by 1860, been for 50 years or so, had been stopping slavers on the high seas, and you could get hung for that. And so the slave trade was down. Of course, their own constitution said there should be no importation of slaves after 1808, which simply meant that they desired the people to breed more on the plantation so that they would still have enough field hands and so forth. So the lack of importation didn't matter in that particular regard. And it just got bigger and bigger, while all the time people were thinking, well, France got rid of it, England got rid of it. In Haiti, there was a revolt which served as an object lesson to the planters. They really feared a slave revolt, didn't they? And what it might mean.
They did. They feared slave revolts, and they feared the influence of free blacks.
Yeah,
And so the revolt in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, is one of the things that makes life more difficult indirectly for free blacks in the United States, who become foci of suspicion and fear.
Right. It amazed me when I read that so many of the small number, relatively speaking, but nonetheless, so many of that small number of free blacks in the South supported the Confederacy. Now, maybe they had no choice.
It's always hard to tell which expressed support because they had no choice and which did so out of conviction. But we need to remember that among the very small free black population to begin with, about 250,000 in the South by the time of the Civil War, there are pockets. The average free black person in the South is very poor and bears all the burdens of suspicion, fear, and racial animosity. But there are pockets, usually of very light-skinned, quote, black people, end quote, such as in and around New Orleans or in Mobile, who entered the United States, or their ancestors did, from areas that were previously part of the Spanish or French empires, where the disabilities that went along with being considered black were less than in the United States. Handfuls of those people could acquire a fair amount of property, and even as they try to distinguish themselves from black people, and signing on with the Confederacy is one way of proving your white credentials. And so that's where you see the loudest protestations of pro-Confederate sentiment among the best off, unusually well off.
There were even among that handful, there is an even smaller handful that, glory be, they owned slaves.
Some did. Many of those who on the books owned slaves actually had simply purchased their spouses. But this was simply a way of freeing a spouse.
Why did what are generally thought of as the poor whites, particularly in the hill country in Alabama and East Tennessee, why did they support the Confederacy? I mean, there were pockets, so-called Jones County, I guess, which is an area of Alabama or Mississippi, where the Confederate troops dasn't go because they would be attacked by guerrillas who were pro-Union or anti-Confederate or whatever.
Anti-Confederate, and that was not only in Jones, but in other sections of Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, even Southwest Virginia. So that was certainly a reality during the Civil War. But your original question, why was there support for the Confederacy among non-slave owners? It's good to remember that 3/4 of the Southern white population did not own slaves.
Right.
So your question is one of the most important questions having to do with the Civil War. Assuming, and I think it's a very good assumption, that the Civil War at bottom is about slavery, how do we explain this? The support by non-slave owners of a pro-slavery Confederacy and a pro-slavery war effort. And I think the answers take us into the conditions and the psychology of this population. Large numbers live near the plantations and are economically interested in the plantations. They work for plantation owners, They derive economic or political or social benefits from being neighbors of slave owners, planters, in order to cultivate this friendly relationship with non-slave owners, might gin the small non-slave owners cotton for free, ship the cotton to market for little or nothing, and in general create a patronship with this individual.
Right.
Meanwhile, the small owner may hope to become a slave owner, aspire to that, or his son goes to work for the slave owner, and so on. So those who live in the hills are more removed from the slavery system and frequently feel more resentment toward the slave owners, but nonetheless are very rarely in favor of emancipation. They have bought the idea, number one, that freeing blacks is dangerous because these people are dangerous, but more importantly, have been fed centuries and certainly generations of racial ideology according to which white people enjoy a favored position precisely because black people are enslaved. And so they feel that their value as human beings and as citizens derives in no small part from the fact that others are excluded from this charmed circle.
You know, it may not be slaves versus non-slaves today, but that phenomenon has never changed, has it? Everybody whom I've ever heard of derives part of their self-worth from thinking they're better than somebody else.
Well, it's certainly a consistent thread throughout much of history, but the degree to which it worked itself into the center of society and social thought and political ideology was much greater in the slave South than it was elsewhere in the country.
You know, two people, I am what is called a hater. And two people whom I detest to this day. One is Nathan Bedford Forrest and the other is Patrick Cleburne. Now, most of the audience will not have heard of either of them, and for sure not of Cleburne. Cleburne was a poor white from Ireland who came over to the South, made a bundle, was very successful, and though unheralded to this day, was one of the South's best generals. And he was a guy who wrote in the about 1864, late 1864, early 1865, he wrote a memorandum saying we should arm the black population of the South and get them to fight for us. And oh my God, was he greeted with, you know, dislike would be a fair way to put it. And Forrest, of course, was just a vicious dog. And you know, his people, when they fought Northern troops, they showed no quarter. They would kill prisoners. I have nothing good to say about the guy. He really was a vicious guy.
It's an interesting choice of demons, since in most people's perceptions, they're at opposite ends of the Confederate political spectrum.
Right, but the thing that caused me to pair them is your statement that the white people aspired to, and some did, work their way up, because they both worked their way up from dire poverty to become very wealthy and to become leaders of Southern society.
And Forrest does it by, in part, working as a slave trader before the Civil War, which even among whites in the South is considered one of the least prestigious, let's put it that way, occupations you can have. Because slave owners frequently offloaded all the sense of whatever guilt there may have been connected to slavery onto the slave traders. We're humane slave owners, but those slave traders, they're unscrupulous. And of course they were unscrupulous.
Well, yes. But interestingly, Bruce, Shelby Foote gave it as his opinion. I don't know where I heard this or where I read it. I think I heard him say it on television. Gave it as his opinion that the two great geniuses of the Civil War were Nathan Bedford Forrest and Abraham Lincoln. Can you feature that?
No, I can't. Forrest was an effective fighter at the level at which he served. But frequently people have said if only he had been placed in control of an army and so on and so forth. the military history of the Civil War is filled with stories of officers who did well at a certain level of command and then were bumped up one level higher and proved incompetent at that level. So John Bell Hood is one good example of that, but he's by no means the only one. Right. And I think the same certainly is true of Forrest.
Right, right. It has been my view forever these days, Bruce, and I'm curious as to your view of my view and of its strengths and its weaknesses. It's been my view that the philosophy of the South, and this will win me no friends south of the Massachusetts line, believe me. The philosophy in the South and the philosophy of Nazi Germany were pretty much the same. It's comprised of what in German is called the Übermenschen and the Untermenschen, the men on top, the men on the bottom, women. And each one thought that they had a right to control particular groups. The Nazis, it was everybody. In the South, it was the whites should have a right to control the blacks. I don't know, you think that there's any similarity at all between the two thought processes?
Not only do I think there are similarities, Hitler thought there were similarities. Hitler admired the racial code of the American South.
Really?
Oh, yes. So you're certainly onto something. The idea, as you say, of a superior race. One of the expressions used is the Herrenvolk, right? Well, for lack of a better phrase, the master race. Right. This certainly is central to the Southern ideology. We need to remember, however, one important distinction, which is the purposes to which these ideologies were put, right? The Southern slave owner wasn't out to exterminate the black population, quite the contrary. Right. These were valuable bodies to them, and so they wanted to preserve and enslave them, whereas in Nazi Germany, by and large, the purpose was to justify the annihilation of a people.
Although, sad to say, there were times when they simply worked them to death or close thing, as close to it as possible before they took them off to the death camps, because they wanted the labor of, and it wasn't just Jews.
You mean the Germans?
Yeah.
Right.
It wasn't just Jews. It was Gypsies and,
Slavs.
Romanians, Slavs. Oh, God, Slavs. So, okay.
When you're ready to make a difference in the world, one law school can make a difference for you. The Massachusetts School of Law is where you learn to become a lawyer. As the most affordable law school in New England, you'll graduate with the most professional skills and the least amount of debt. Our small classes ensure a rich learning experience and a campus environment so special, our students don't want to leave. The Massachusetts School of Law, we're ready to make a difference for you. Visit us today at mslaw.edu.
I think it is your opinion that the war wrought a tremendous change in political power in the United States. And A, why don't you discuss that? And B, I grew up in the era of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. After that, I fell off the map. But I know a lot about those times, and I lived through those times. And it's always been my opinion that the South in those days wielded vastly disproportionate power, perhaps in large part because of the seniority system in Congress.
Exactly.
And so that whatever power these people lost because of Appomattox, within 15, 20 years, and the North going soft on Reconstruction, they began to get a lot of it back. Why don't you address all of that?
Okay. First thing, and one of the most important parts of this story is to remember that we say the South. and what power it owned. It's a different South. It's a South where the elite after the Civil War may, in fact, include large numbers of the same individuals who were part of the elite before the war, but they're not a slave-owning class anymore. And so one can say without any, I think, contradiction that the slave-owning class, which had controlled political life in the United States at the national level for most of that pre-war era, has no political power after the Civil War because it doesn't even exist anymore. So that's the easiest way to make a distinction. But even at another level, the distinction between the amount of political power that the Southern elite exercises nationally before the war and, say, between Lincoln's election and Woodrow Wilson's election, so it's a little earlier than the time that you and I remember, is very, very sharp. So we were saying earlier that in the pre-war period, South was usually enjoying a president from its own ranks in the White House. Same was true of the Supreme Court. The same was true of Speaker of the House. That was rarely true between Lincoln's election and Wilson's. The proportions are at least reversed. You don't have, I think there's no Southerner in the White House after Andrew Johnson, and Andrew Johnson's not elected to the presidency until Woodrow Wilson. The number of justices from the South is radically reduced. The same is true of the speakers of the House of Representatives. Moreover, it's good to remember that while the South in that era still exercises some power at the national level, it does so through the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is a minority party in that era for most of the time. So between Lincoln and Wilson, once again, there's only one Democrat elected to the presidency, and that's Grover Cleveland, who's a Northerner.
Right.
So our memories from the 1960s and the 1970s can give us a false impression of what the post-war decades were like.
Right, right. That's really interesting. Wasn't Cleveland the guy of whom they had a ditty, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa, gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha"?
I think I remember a political cartoon that looked like that.
Because he had an illegitimate child.
Well, political cartoons were pretty rough in those days.
Yeah, I guess. Here's something, Bruce. Number one, I wish they taught what you have just said about the flip in eras from, up to 1860, then up to 1912. Or, well, actually 1920 was the end of Wilson's tenure. And then again to the Republicans, then to Roosevelt. I wish they would teach that more often, because most of us have had no concept of how, particularly in the late 19th century, the last 30 years, this flip occurred.
Excuse me for interrupting.
No, go ahead.
One of my students always are amazed to learn that at its inception, the Republican Party was the radical political party. The left-wing political party in the United States, and the Democrats was the Southern-based conservative political party.
Right.
And they always looked at me aghast and say, "What happened between then and now?"
Let me ask that question.
See, I put my foot in it right there.
No, it's clearly quite true. I guess one would say that what happened was that the Republicans became the allies of big business, and many of them were big businessmen, and it changed the whole attitude of the party from, what, 1880 on?
Well, I think that's really key. Businessmen become much more conservative over the course of the 19th and into the 20th century. In the 1860s, they feel themselves, or at least many, feel themselves to be and are the cutting edge of progress, including personal liberation. And they're contrasting themselves still with feudalism and slavery. Once those wars are won, and they don't feel challenged from the right, they start to feel menaced elsewhere, and they start to see menace in the ranks of their legally free employees, start to resent demands of the former slaves for a little bit more than simply political freedom from slavery, and you see a march to the right throughout the rest of the 19th century. Meanwhile, over that subsequent century, the Democratic Party, or at least the Northern Democratic Party, changes its base of support. So the Democratic Party, by the end of Truman's era, while it includes obviously a politically powerful core of Southern Democrats, now depends for electoral support on Northern wage earners and immigrants and black people. And that has a lot to do with its change of political stance.
Right. It really is odd. You know, it's like McClellan's change of base on the peninsula. It went, just flipped it right around. Why did Lincoln and Seward and so many of the people of the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, beginning of the 60s, think that if left alone, slavery would die out? The general thought was, I guess, by about 1910, 1920. Why did they think it would die out?
There's one school of thought that said slavery will die out on its own, no matter what. And that was based on this sort of Pollyannish notion that since it had happened in the North and it happened in the British Empire, this was an inevitability. They believed, for example, that the labor performed by legally free people was, quote, of course, end quote, more productive than the labor performed by enslaved people.
That was true, was it not?
That was not true.
That was not true.
When someone is standing over you with a whip and controls every moment of your life, they are capable of squeezing an enormous amount of effort out of you. So in fact, legally free former slaves, the freed people after the Civil War, managed to work, it won't be surprising to anybody to hear, I think, less intensively, less long hours, fewer days of the week than before the Civil War, much to the unhappiness of the landowners of the South. Because under slavery, you have nearly limitless power to coerce exertion out of the people you own. But Adam Smith said that slave labor is not productive and is not profitable, and many people kept waiting for the Southerners to recognize that fact. Well, as I said, it wasn't really a fact, and it was not likely to be, therefore, discovered anytime soon. So the idea that slavery was simply going to die by itself was a mirage. And more Northerners began to recognize that fact over the course of time. What the Republican Party thought was that if it could stop slavery from expanding physically, that would eventually choke the system to death. Because virtually everybody in the United States in those days thought that slavery was a system that needed to expand in order to survive.
Why did they think that?
Well, there were various reasons. One was that slave-based agriculture tended at the time, for various reasons, to exhaust the soil. So in cotton country, in tobacco country, you see the soil initially planted beginning to lose the nutrients necessary to sustain that crop. And so the people growing that crop are continually moving west.
Can I ask you a question? Yes, I know that they moved west into Alabama and Mississippi, but I take it that a presupposition of what you're saying is that they never let fields lie fallow in order to recover. They were too greedy to do that.
That's a fact. So we're talking about perception rather than the underlying reality. It is very likely true that had slave labor been used in a different manner, it would not have exhausted the soil. But it wasn't. And that was true, by the way, in the North as well. There was a very careless attitude towards replenishing the soil throughout the United States, which helps explain why agriculture in New England suffers over the course of time.
There's this wonderful line in the movie Gettysburg. People get sick of me talking about that movie because I think that in that movie there is everything in life. Lincoln thought that in the Civil War there was everything in life. And there's this one place where Chamberlain's addressing the troops who've been brought to him as alleged mutineers. And he says, it's not the land. There's always more land. That seems to have been the attitude.
Yeah, there's always more land because we can keep taking it away from the American Indians or the Native Americans, and then we can take it away from the Mexicans, and so here's this whole continent that we can move on to, and that was a mindset. For whatever reason, the slave-based agriculture of the South was in fact exhausting the soil and seemed therefore capable of surviving only if it kept spreading.
Right.
Just as important, if not more important, ultimately, though, is the feeling that if the South, if the slave states cannot keep themselves surrounded by other states in which slavery is legal, if instead they find themselves surrounded by states filled with people hostile to slavery, the slaves in the slave states will have some place to which to escape. And that's a danger. And finally, if the new states, and there are constant source of new states, become free states or enter the Union as free states, the South is going to lose the ability to control the federal government. And ultimately, perhaps, lose the ability to stop the passage of an amendment to the Constitution that will outlaw slavery, or that there will be other measures passed by the federal government that will inhibit slavery even without touching it directly within the slave states. So there's a political sense that slavery needs to keep expanding in order to retain control of the federal government. So in this sense, it is hoped that slavery can be made to choke to death. And then it is hoped that the slave owners, confronting these realities, that they are surrounded with non-slave states and hostile states, will eventually see the writing on the wall, as the northern states did earlier, and eventually replace slavery with freedom.
For 25 years, the Massachusetts School of Law has been training great lawyers and building great relationships.
Joining MSL was more than just making friends. It was becoming a part of a family, which makes it very difficult to leave.
I don't want to leave MSL. We didn't want to leave MSL ever! Best decision ever! We love MSL! We don't want to leave!
The Massachusetts School of Law. Great lawyers, better people. Come join our family. Visit us today at mslaw.edu.
I think the question was so important about why did the poor people go along with it? Because,
absolutely,
you know, the old saying, rich man's war, poor man's fight, they understood that this is, at least after a while, they understood this was not their fight.
Some of them did. Some of them came to understand that. I mean, throughout the pre-war era, the factors that we were discussing earlier, aspirations to become slave owners, links to slave owners, shared ideology, racial ideology at least, with slave owners, was enough to keep slave owners in political power with the support of non-slave owners. It's only after the passage of time in the Civil War and the increasing burdens that standing by the slave owners are imposing on non-slave owners that at least sections of the non-slave owners basically say, that's enough.
One would think, based on that, one would think that Sherman's march to the sea must have had a hell of an influence.
Absolutely.
I mean, there it is. He's showing these poor whites and everybody else that the Confederate governments cannot stop the rapine of the South, that they're just going to lose everything. Rich and poor alike are just going to lose everything if they keep this up.
I don't think there's much question about that. Sherman's march through Georgia certainly breaks the will of that state so far as continuing to fight the Civil War is concerned. And as his army begins to churn its way northward from there, it continues to have that effect.
You know, you have a picture in the book. It's a very famous picture, really, of Richmond after the war. And the only picture that I can remember ever seeing similar to that, and worse, really, is Berlin after the war.
I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah, yeah. The only difference is that some of the buildings, they still had one wall of 3 or 4 stories standing in Richmond, and in Berlin nothing was higher than 5 feet.
Right, airplanes makes a big difference.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So it wasn't just fire. And so anyway, these people finally began to get the message that they're fighting and they're dying. The husbands are dying, the sons are dying, the brothers are dying, and it's all for a bunch of wealthy people who, incidentally, you point out, they would not give up any of their economic power in order to aid the South in the war.
There is a substantial number of slave owners, including some of the most economically and politically powerful slave owners in the South, many of whom are gung-ho for secession and for fighting the war, but feel that they're fighting the war in defense of their prerogatives as masters and as planters, and are not about to give up those prerogatives, even for the sake of prosecuting the war to defend those prerogatives.
Right.
That's one of the great ironies, I think, I'm trying to convey in the book.
Right.
This extreme short-sightedness among some of these planters.
I think one of the reasons, I'm guessing, that one of the reasons this hasn't been understood more widely is that they fought. The planters fought.
Yes,
there were many of the generals and the colonels and the lieutenant colonels, and a lot of them died, and people don't understand that, which is, by our modern lights, a great irony. They're willing to put their lives and their children's lives on the line and to lose them, but don't take my property.
There is a phrase that in the course of writing my last 2 books, I came across over and over and over again, and it almost becomes boilerplate in the South, which is, in the South, and this is not something being said by Northerners, said these people, referring to the planters, will give up their fathers, their husbands, their sons, and themselves, but put one hand on their Negroes, or their horses, or their cotton, and what a howl you will hear. They identified their wealth as even more valuable than their lives in many cases.
To the modern mind, this is just purely amazing. I know that, I am aware, at least I think, that from, what would you say, 1880 on, 1890 on, there have been people of enormous consequence in American society who wield the power they do, politically and financially, because of the money they have. But, and they're very keen, and they do everything they can to ensure their economic interests, blah, blah, blah. I don't have to get into all that. But I never, ever heard any of them say, I'd rather, remember the old saying, I'd rather be dead than red? I've never heard them saying it. I'd rather be dead than lose any of my property.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about an extreme case, right?
Yeah.
Of short-sightedness. On the other hand, if we want to pursue this, people who pollute the air, manufacturers who pollute the air, pollute the water, pollute the food, and so on and so forth, their families have to breathe that air, drink that water, or swim in that water, eat that food. That doesn't stop them from going ahead and doing it.
Right.
So there is, there are continuities across the eras.
Interesting.
In some respects.
One pollution you forgot, you left out, pollute the thought process.
Well, that's right.
When you're ready to make a difference in the world, one law school can make a difference for you. The Massachusetts School of Law is where you learn to become a lawyer. As the most affordable law school in New England, you'll graduate with the most professional skills and the least amount of debt. Our small classes ensure a rich learning experience and a campus environment so special, our students don't want to leave. The Massachusetts School of Law, we're ready to make a difference for you. Visit us today at mslaw.edu.
Lincoln didn't think, and Seward didn't think, and the Republicans, I guess, in general didn't think, for whatever reason, that the Southerners were serious about secession. They thought this is just they're blowing off again. How did they miss this?
Well, various Southerners had been threatening to secede for decades. Cross this line and we'll secede. I mean, they had been running this.
They didn't use the phrase red line, I hope.
No. but the idea we're going to pull out if you don't respect our rights was a very old one. Went back even to the 1790s. And it had never happened. So I think people in the North were entitled to say, or at least to think, or at least to hope, that this was all a bluff. And I think they really didn't understand the depths to which, well, they didn't understand a lot of things. They didn't understand how much support slavery had among non-slave owners, number one, for reasons now we've discussed more than once. They also didn't recognize the depth of commitment to slavery on the part of the slave owners. They thought of this, Northerners apparently thought of slaveholding as one possible business that the Southern elite happened to be engaged in, but could switch their investment someplace else without much difficulty. And didn't seem to understand that a whole social psychology had grown up out of this kind of society and this kind of labor system that made for an absolutely last-ditch attachment to slavery, not as one possible investment, but as a civilization. And if this goes down, everything we value goes down too.
Right.
And lastly, I think all of us have difficulty imagining a tomorrow that's radically different from today. Everybody pretty much expects the future to be some variation of what they've already experienced, which is why we're always caught off guard when history takes a sharp turn.
Right.
And this is a classic example.
The Southerners, on the other hand, and I remember discussing this probably on this show, but perhaps elsewhere, with Joe Ellis about George Washington's slave, whose name I think was Billy, and who Washington, who ran away when he got the chance in New Jersey or somewhere. And just Washington was astounded because it never occurred to him that Billy was anything but a happily attached, servant. Please don't call these people slaves; they're servants.
Right.
How did the South? I mean, Washington is an example, but the entire South seemed to somehow get the idea. And my question is, how did this occur? That their slaves loved them or attached to them. The people in the South were shocked out of their minds when the Northern armies got close, and all of a sudden, slaves are leaving the plantations in droves.
Right.
How did the Southerners get this idea?
In order to justify this system in their own minds, especially once the slaves are converted to Christianity, so now we're all Christians. In order to justify the enslavement of one Christian by another, it's necessary to say, not only am I doing it for the good of the other person, but that other person also recognizes that this is a beneficial arrangement from their point of view too. Well, if not democracy, at least paternalism or some version of that. These people are inferior. We know that they are inferior. They know, says the ideology, that they're inferior. And they are pleased to have somebody replacing their own inferior judgment with superior judgment, and so on and so forth. So in other words, this is a self-justification on the part of the planters, but also the slaves mirror this back to the slave owners for the sake of survival. Enslaved people learn to show a face toward the slave owners that they think the slave owners want to see. So Charles Colcock Jones Sr., the leading evangelist to the slaves in the South and himself a major Georgia planter, comments sometime before the Civil War that one can live one's whole life among blacks and never really see what they're thinking because you're wise not to show what you're thinking. And you only show it, in the case of the Civil War, when opportunity allows you to show it without facing the death penalty or some other form of punishment in consequence.
But, you know, which only proves that they're no fools.
Precisely.
Yeah. There was a guy whose name is lost to American history, but not to historians, whose name was Hinton Helper. And I think it was about 1854, he was North Carolinian, and about 1854, 1855, he wrote a book on what the South should do to get off this petard that was hoisted upon. Boy, did he catch the very devil, you know, the traitor and this and that. So if the truth had occurred to you and you were a Southerner, you better keep your mouth shut, even if you're white.
Absolutely. Once upon a time, the beginning of the 19th century, there were a fair number of Southern Protestant ministers who were preaching the necessity of gradually emancipating slaves. Well, they're eventually driven either out of the South or into silence or into recanting their views on the subject.
Yep. You know, I don't want to get into specifics because people of this generation will, of course, disagree violently on the specifics, but I would have to say nothing's changed. It may not be slavery today. It may be other things. Shall we fight a war here? Shall we do this? Shall we do that? People take a position for which they get just utterly lambasted. So if you have any sense, you keep your mouth shut because the rest of the country just doesn't want to hear it. I'm not, well, I'm just
Well, I would say that, you know, there's a lot to that, but we owe a lot to people who, despite that, open their mouths because at least it allows some other people who are a little bit more open-minded to have that light in, to let that light in. And we saw in the case of, for example, the Vietnam War, and there's here a slight parallel to the Civil War. I remember the beginning of the Vietnam War. By the way, the beginning of the war in Iraq. Everybody was gung-ho. Anybody who opened their mouths against the war was a traitor and a criminal and not supporting our troops and so on and so forth. But as in the case of the South and the Civil War, if that war goes on long enough and goes as badly as Iraq and Vietnam went, a large number of people who originally would have ridden you out of town on a rail become a little bit more open to what you have to say, perhaps.
Well, I agree with that as somebody who was a strong opponent of the Vietnam War from about the beginning of 1966 onward. I can't claim to have had the same prescience, if that's the word for it, with regard to Iraq. But I think that what you said, the examples you have cited are absolutely right on. Absolutely right on.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments, providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu, training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
I want to thank you for coming. It's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful book. It's the first book I've read that has just about everything in it.
Very kind of you to say so.
Yeah. Anyhow, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. I hope that you enjoyed the program and found it instructive. I certainly found the book instructive, as well as some of the things that I had not known from the book that were said here today by Professor Levine. And I hope you will be with us again the next time for the next installment of Books of Our Time.